On a quiet spring afternoon, a lone truck rolled into Evergreen Hills, carrying a man and the German shepherd who had once braved the darkest corners of Frost Hollow to save a family. What awaited them was not danger, but a reunion, one that would prove some bonds are forged beyond blood. In a small yellow house, laughter, memories, and an unexpected gift would turn the visit into something far more profound. But as the sun dipped low and Axel took his place on the porch, a silent promise was made, one you'll want to witness until the very last moment. The night had fallen heavy over Frost Hollow, a quiet town nestled deep within the folding arms of ancient pine forests, where the cold crept in like whispered secrets and the wind carried stories no one dared to speak aloud. Outside, a relentless blizzard painted the world in strokes of white and gray snowflakes, drifting through the dark air like ashes fallen from a dying fire, swirling and settling, until everything disappeared beneath their cold embrace. Through the storm's biting breath, a solitary figure moved with steady purpose. Caleb Ward was a man carved by time and haunted by the invisible wounds of war. A former soldier now bound to memories that refused to fade and to a companion who never left his side. His boots crunched through the deep snow with a rhythm matched only by the soft, deliberate steps of Axel the German shepherd, who walked just ahead. Nose lowered, eyes alert, a sentinel, guarding a fractured soul. Caleb was 45, but the years etched themselves into his face as clearly as the scars left behind on his skin and spirit. His jaw, once broad and commanding, was now softened by days-old stubble, and his eyes, a pale, stormy blue, held the weight of battles fought both abroad and within. The faint indentations on the right side of his face told a story of a distant explosion, a cruel reminder that the world he had known was forever changed. But tonight, amid the swirling storm and frozen silence, it was not the ghosts of war that haunted him. It was the unexpected flicker of life just beyond the edge of the woods. Axel's tail swept behind him in a steady metronome of focus, his black and tan coat thickening against the winter chill. 6 years had passed since he first joined Caleb in his wandering, 6 years of shared silence and unspoken trust. Axel carried his own marks of survival, a long scar traced diagonally down his front leg, a souvenir from their last tour worn like a badge of honor. He did not limp anymore, but the memory of pain lingered in the steady grace of his movements. As they rounded a bend near the old bus stop where the road curved away from town, Axel's pace slowed, ears pricking forward, head tilting with an urgency that pulled Caleb's gaze into the swirling fog. There in the snow, a figure emerged, small and fragile, too small to be left alone in such a merciless night. Caleb's breath caught as he broke into a jog, his boots leaving deeper imprints in the pristine powder heart, pounding louder than the howl of the wind. Axel moved ahead with measured steps, cautious but unyielding until they both reached the source of the disturbance. A little girl no older than 6 stood barefoot in the unforgiving cold, her feet red and curling against the ice, trembling like the branches above weighed down by snow. Her hair, pale blonde and tangled, was frosted with ice crystals that sparkled faintly in the scarce light. Her cheeks bore the raw kiss of frozen tears, and the thin pink sweatshirt that hung off one shoulder was soaked and clung to her small frame like a second skin. In her arms, she cradled something precious and fragile, a newborn baby, swaddled in a threadbare blanket stiff with cold, the only warmth against the cruel night. Caleb slowed to a crouch, every instinct of a soldier, a protector and a survivor, rising to the surface. His voice was low and steady as he reached out one hand, careful not to startle the frightened child. "Hey there," he said gently. "You're safe now." The girl blinked up at him, eyes wide, and lost a silent plea tangled in their depths. She hugged the baby tighter, shivering violently as the wind whispered around them both. Then, with a voice so soft it might have been carried away by the storm, she whispered 4 words that struck Caleb deeper than any battle cry. "They took my mom." No questions came, only the solemn understanding that sometimes words were not yet ready to be spoken aloud. Without hesitation, Caleb shed his coat and wrapped the thick fabric around the trembling child, the garment engulfing her tiny frame and offering a fragile shield against the biting cold. Axel stepped forward, lowering his head to gently press his warm nose against Mira's wrist. The girl flinched, startled, but then her eyes locked with the dog's steady gaze, and for a brief moment a softness bloomed on her face. A fragile trust that, perhaps here in this strange man and his loyal companion, she had found sanctuary. Caleb exhaled slowly and lifted Mira into his arms, careful to support both her and the infant she carried. They began the slow trek back through the snow-covered forest, every step weighed with urgency and the promise of warmth ahead. The path narrowed beneath the heavy boughs, the world beyond the trees lost to the swirling storm. Yet Caleb's steps were sure guided by countless journeys along this same trail, a silent dance through frost and shadow. The cabin awaited beyond the bend, tucked deep within the pines like a secret whispered to the stars. Its weathered timbers creaked softly as the blizzard pressed against its walls, a small beacon of light in the vast, cold wilderness. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, casting flickering amber shadows across rough wooden floorboards, and the three figures huddled close against the night's chill. Mira sat curled in the armchair, wrapped tightly in Caleb's coat, her arms encircling Eli as if her very breath could keep him alive. The baby's small face was flushed, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms. Caleb crouched nearby, his gaze steady but silent. He had made tea hours ago now, cold and untouched. Understanding well the language of silence that filled the room, Axel lay at Caleb's feet, his head resting on his crossed paws, eyes golden and watchful in the firelight, ears flicking at every sound, listening, waiting, feeling the tension that rippled like a current beneath the quiet. There were no promises spoken that night, only the heavy weight of unspoken fears and a fragile hope held tight between man-dog and child. Mira's whispered words echoed in Caleb's mind, a sharp reminder of the darkness that had crept too close and the courage it would take to bring light into the shadows. As the fire danced its steady dance, casting long, wavering shapes on the walls, Caleb traced the worn edge of Mira's pendant with a calloused finger, and Axel's warm presence settled over him like a shield. Somewhere beyond the cabin's walls, the storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Yet inside, a quiet battle was just beginning, a fight not against distant enemies, but the ones hidden close, wrapped in lies and shadows. And as Caleb sat there cradling hope in the form of a trembling girl and her fragile brother, the night whispered its secrets, and the first threads of a new journey began to weave themselves between the falling snow. What awaited them beyond the forest's edge? Who had taken Mira's mother, and why? And could a soldier, a dog, and two children face the darkness ahead? The answers lay buried beneath the snow, waiting for dawn to reveal them. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Frost Hollow, was a haven from the storm, a small fortress against the bitter winter that pressed hard against its sturdy walls. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting scent of pine wood and smoldering embers, a fragile warmth that wove its way through the dimly lit room. Shadows danced softly upon the rough-hewn beams, flickering in time with the fire's quiet crackle and hiss, casting the world outside into oblivion. Mira sat curled tightly in the armchair beside the hearth, her small body wrapped in the heavy coat Caleb had given her, a cocoon, shielding her from the memories and the cold alike. In her arms lay Eli, his fragile form swaddled in threadbare blankets, his breath shallow but steady, a whisper of life against the vast silence. Mira's fingers clung to him, as if holding the baby close could somehow protect them both from the unknown dangers lurking beyond the cabin's fragile walls. Her wide eyes, still glistening with frozen tears, found Caleb's face as he knelt nearby, careful not to break the fragile calm that had settled like a tentative promise. The weight of her gaze was profound, far beyond what one might expect from a child so small. It was a look filled with both fear and resolve, a knowledge that the world had shifted beneath her feet and nothing would ever be the same. Without a word, Mira reached beneath the folds of Caleb's coat and withdrew a delicate silver pendant. The heart-shaped charm was worn and tarnished at the edges, its surface etched with a tender inscription, "To love, always. Mom." She held it out to Caleb, her fingers trembling slightly, offering a piece of the past she was desperate to preserve. Caleb accepted the pendant with reverent care, turning it slowly in his palm, as though the cold metal might somehow carry the warmth of Clara's love. The inscription was a whispered echo of hope in a world shrouded by shadows. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love could be the brightest flame. But Mira was not finished. From the same hidden pocket, she produced a small, crumpled piece of paper, its edges softened by countless folds. Caleb unfolded it gently, revealing a hurried scrawl that made his pulse quicken. "Don't trust anyone without a dog." The words hung in the cabin like a silent alarm, a warning etched in haste and desperation. The urgency behind them was unmistakable, a secret passed from mother to daughter, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the window panes and stirring the flames to brighter life. Axel rose from his resting place by Caleb's feet, his sleek black and tan coat gleaming faintly in the firelight as he rose to his paws. His nose twitched, nostrils flaring, as he stepped cautiously to the door, his gaze sharp and alert. Caleb followed, stepping out into the cold that bit through even the thick walls of the cabin. The snow had softened to a gentle hush, settling like powdered sugar over the ground. But Axel's keen nose traced a path that had escaped the eye, a set of footprints, fresh and deliberate, circling near the cabin's edge. Their presence was an unspoken threat, a silent witness to the invisible danger that had closed in around them. The prints told a story of watchfulness, of someone lurking close by, unseen, but not absent. Caleb crouched to examine the tracks, the cold seeping through his gloves as his fingers brushed the crisp outlines pressed into the snow. They were too large and heavy for Mira, too shallow for someone carrying a child, marking a solitary figure who had paced this frozen ground under the cloak of night. His mind raced through possibilities, shadows of suspicion swirling like the snowflakes around him. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, a tempest of questions, fears, and the pressing need to act. Yet despite the danger pressing near, Caleb's resolve held firm. He would not rush to summon the authorities just yet. The world beyond Frost Hollow was complicated, riddled with shadows and secrets that the local law might not understand, or worse, fail to unravel. He needed to gather the threads of truth before unraveling the tapestry of lies. Inside, Mira watched from the window, her small hands pressed against the cold glass, as if willing the storm to hold back its fury. Her trust in Caleb and Axel was a fragile thread, stretched taut across an expanse of uncertainty. But it was enough to kindle a fragile hope in her heart. Caleb turned back to the cabin, the pendant still warm in his palm, the paper folded carefully and tucked close to his chest. Axel followed the steadfast guardian whose silent watchfulness spoke volumes beyond words. The fire crackled a heartbeat in the darkness, its golden glow casting long shadows that danced like ghosts upon the walls. The night stretched on, filled with the quiet breaths of two children, the measured breaths of a man carrying the weight of too many battles, and the steady presence of a dog whose loyalty was fierce and unyielding. Outside, the storm whispered secrets through the trees, but inside, a small sanctuary held fast against the night. Yet the questions remained pressing and relentless. Who had taken Clara? Why was the warning so urgent? And what lay hidden beneath the white veil of snow that covered Frost Hollow? Caleb sat back against the wall, his eyes tracing the flickering flames, as if searching for answers in their shifting shapes. He could not yet see the path ahead clearly, but one thing was certain: This night was only the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of courage, trust, and the bonds that held them together. And as the fire's warmth spread through the cabin, mingling with the soft breaths of Mira and Eli, the first threads of a secret began to unravel, a secret that would soon draw them into a world where danger hid behind familiar faces and where the smallest acts of bravery could light the way through the darkest storms. Morning had not yet fully broken over Frost Hollow, but the storm had spent its fury, leaving behind a quiet world dusted in pristine snow and veiled in a pale, fragile light that seeped softly through the bare branches. The forest held its breath beneath the weight of winter's retreat, and the distant calls of waking birds stirred like whispers of hope in the crisp air. Inside, Caleb Ward's battered pickup warmth fought back the lingering chill. Mira Lane sat in the back seat, cradling Eli gently in her arms, his small form swathed in layers of blankets, his breath steady but shallow. The silence inside the vehicle was thick with unspoken questions, each mile carrying them closer to the next thread in a story tangled with fear and desperate courage. Caleb's hands gripped the steering wheel with quiet determination. Axel resting alert in the passenger seat, his eyes sharp and watchful as the truck rumbled through the winding roads toward the edge of town. Their destination was a modest house on the far side of Frost Hollow, a place that held answers behind closed doors and guarded by an unlikely sentinel. Walter Briggs was a man etched by years, his frame tall and lean, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of decades spent in quiet labor. The deep lines carved into his weathered face told tales of toil and steadfastness, while his eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, glimmered with a watchful intelligence that had earned him a reputation as the town's reluctant guardian. His modest home smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon oil, a comforting blend that seemed to soften the harsh edges of a world too often cruel and unyielding. Walter's pride lay in his collection of security cameras, a patchwork network he had painstakingly installed over the years, a web of watchful eyes aimed at keeping the unseen dangers at bay. Caleb had met Walter only once before, but it was clear from the brief exchange that the older man held a quiet respect for the soldier and his dog, recognizing the weight they both carried in their own ways. Now, as they gathered in the living room, Mira clung to Eli, her gaze flickering with both fear and cautious hope. Walter guided Caleb to the bank of monitors that flickered softly in the dim light, each screen casting a pale glow that illuminated the room's worn furnishings. The hum of technology was a stark contrast to the ancient pines outside. But here in this quiet sanctuary, time seemed to hold its breath. With practiced fingers, Walter pulled up footage from the early hours before dawn, the night still fresh and heavy with secrets. The grainy images flickered into focus, revealing a quiet street corner at the edge of Frost Hollow. The angle was wide but high, just enough to capture the intersection near Clara Lane's home. Caleb's eyes narrowed as the clock on the screen ticked toward 4:58 a.m. when the headlights of a large black SUV sliced through the fog like twin beacons in the night. The vehicle rolled slowly to a stop, directly in front of the modest house, the silence broken only by the crunch of tires against the snow. Two figures emerged, their white coats stark against the dimness, surgical caps and masks obscuring their faces like phantoms summoned from a nightmare. There was no knock, no warning, only the cold efficiency of their movements as they approached the door. Mira's breath caught as she recognized the scene unfolding on the screen. Her small fingers curled tighter around Eli's blanket, and a tremor passed through her body, a fragile thread of fear woven with the faintest glimmer of defiance. The two figures reappeared moments later, one clutching Clara between them. She was upright, but slumped, her movements dazed and uncertain. The back door of the SUV opened silently to receive them, a shadow swallowing a precious life with no hint of mercy. Caleb froze the frame, his gaze sharpening as the light caught the face of one of the men. The image revealed a sharp vertical scar running down the left side of his jaw, a cruel slash that marked him unmistakably. It was a wound that bore the weight of countless stories, a symbol of violence that lingered beyond flesh and bone. Mira's eyes locked on the screen, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's him," she said, the certainty in her tone belying her years. He looked at me through the hallway mirror. He didn't blink. Caleb nodded solemnly, the gravity of her words sinking deep into the room. "You remember that much?" Walter asked gently, sensing the weight of memory pressing on the child. "Smart kids don't forget faces," Caleb replied. "Especially not ones like that." Mira shifted in her seat, reaching into her small backpack and pulling out a spiral-bound notebook. She sat cross-legged on the floor, and within moments, a pencil danced across the page, tracing lines that formed the unmistakable shape of the man's face. Her hand trembled slightly as she sketched, but her strokes were deliberate and steady, each line drawn with the clarity of a memory, etched into the very core of her being. The portrait took shape, a square jaw set beneath cropped hair, hidden partially beneath the surgical cap, the jagged scar that sliced through the left side of his face, his expression cold and unreadable. Caleb leaned closer, studying the drawing as if it might unlock a door to the future. "That's him." Caleb confirmed, his voice low but unwavering. "We need to find out everything about this man." Walter nodded, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Here, it's got the footage you need. But keep it quiet. The town has eyes and ears everywhere." Caleb folded the drive carefully into his pocket. The weight of it, a tangible reminder that this was no longer a quiet fight. It was a war waged in shadows and whispers. As Axel lay alert by Caleb's side, the dog's ears flicking toward every creak and murmur, Caleb's mind raced with the implications. Someone powerful was watching, moving, with a cold, calculated precision that left no room for error. Outside, the snow began to fall again, light and ash-like, dusting the world in a fragile veil of white. Mira's small hand slipped into Caleb's, seeking the warmth of a promise he could not yet voice. The road ahead was uncertain, the path tangled with dangers unseen and truths yet to be uncovered. But one thing was clear: the scarred man on the screen was only the beginning. And as the pale dawn stretched its fingers through the frosted windows, Caleb made a silent vow to unravel the secrets cloaked beneath the snow and to bring Clara home. The first light of day broke slowly over Frost Hollow, a pale wash of gray that seeped through the bare trees and dusted the world in muted shades of winter. The storm had softened its roar, leaving behind a cold stillness that seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for the next move in a game played long in shadows. Caleb Ward's boots crunched on the packed snow outside Frost Hollow Medical, a small building that sat like a forgotten relic on the town's edge. Its faded green paint peeled away in curling layers, the sign above the door hanging crooked by a single rusted chain. Though still technically open, the clinic carried the weight of neglect, a place where whispered rumors and unseen truths had settled like dust on empty counters. Axel stayed close by Caleb's side, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, ears flicking at every subtle sound. The German shepherd's presence was a steadying force amid the cold uncertainty. A living sentinel whose instincts Caleb trusted more than any map or plan. Inside the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, mingled with stale coffee and forgotten hopes. The waiting room was sparse with a few worn chairs and a cluttered coffee table scattered with outdated magazines. Flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast an eerie rhythm. The hum broken only by distant footsteps echoing down sterile hallways. At the front desk stood Paige Rowan, a woman whose face bore the marks of both fatigue and fierce determination. Dark curls were pulled tightly back from her face, and a small sunflower pin on her scrubs caught the light as she looked up, eyes widening with a mix of surprise and concern. Mira Page's voice was soft but urgent, like a lifeline thrown across a sea of trouble. She stepped around the desk, moving with the grace of someone used to holding pieces of broken stories together. Caleb nodded, his gaze steady. "We need to talk about Clara." Page's expression tightened, and she led them quietly through the maze of halls to a small break room at the back. The room was humble, with linoleum floors and a buzzing refrigerator that hummed a monotonous lullaby. She offered tea, but no one took it. The silence that followed spoke volumes. "She's missing," Caleb said simply. "Taken. Mira told me 2 people dressed as medical staff came for her before dawn." Page's fingers trembled as she covered her mouth, her eyes glistening with unspoken fears. "I had a feeling something like this might happen," she admitted, voice low. "Clara wasn't like the rest of us. She questioned things, especially after Dr. Adrian Voss arrived." Caleb leaned in, waiting. Page's eyes darkened. "Voss came from Portland 6 months ago. He was smooth, always in expensive shoes and silk ties, claiming he was here for a new drug study. Said it was for pain management for rural patients. But Clara didn't buy it," Caleb prompted. "Not one bit. She started digging checking charts. Patients were getting meds they never consented to. Some got sicker, not better. She filed a formal complaint 3 weeks ago." Page's voice faltered as she pulled a folded letter from her pocket, the paper worn and creased. Then the threats started. First one said, "Careful what you ask for." Then this, "Stay silent if you want your daughter to be safe." Mira's grip on Eli tightened, but she didn't cry. Her wide eyes held a depth far beyond her years, a quiet knowing of dangers adults often tried to hide. Caleb glanced at Page. "Did anyone else stand with her?" Page hesitated. "A few of us suspected something was wrong, but Voss had the administrator Harvey Kane wrapped around his finger." Kane was all smiles and bureaucratic platitudes, always dismissing concerns. "And Voss?" Caleb asked. "Left town 2 days ago," Page said, voice heavy with doubt. "But I saw his car late last night. I thought maybe it was my eyes playing tricks." Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of a trap tightening around them all. As they spoke, Axel's ears pricked suddenly, his body stiffening with alertness. He moved toward the front door and stopped beneath a weathered street lamp. His nose twitched, and then he let out a low, gruff bark that cut through the tense air. Caleb followed the dog's gaze and spotted it, a small, almost invisible device mounted discreetly on the lamppost. At first glance, it looked like part of the city's equipment, but a careful eye revealed a seam too clean, a plastic cover that obscured a tiny lens. "A camera," Caleb murmured, stepping closer, but careful not to touch it. "Disguised." Page's eyes widened in alarm. "They're watching us." The realization settled like ice in Caleb's veins. This was no ordinary surveillance. It was a calculated, invasive watchfulness meant to keep them under control, to silence the truth before it could speak. Axel circled the base of the pole once, then fixed his sharp gaze toward the dark woods beyond, as if sensing that the eyes behind the lens were only part of the danger lurking in the shadows. Caleb's mind raced with plans and possibilities. Every step forward had to be measured, every word weighed against the threat that could be lurking in every corner. But he would not back down. Not when lives, Clara's, Mira's, Eli's, hung in the balance. He turned back toward Page and Mira, the fire of determination burning brighter in his chest. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly. "We need to find out what's really happening here." Mira nodded, her small face set with a courage that defied the cold and the fear. Eli stirred in her arms, a faint whimper escaping his lips. And Axel lay at their feet, a silent guardian, ready for whatever came next. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets and warnings alike. And as the shadows lengthened and the day faded toward dusk, Caleb knew this was only the beginning. a fragile thread leading deeper into a web of lies, betrayal, and hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. The sky over Frost Hollow had shifted from pale gray to the dim, steely hue of late afternoon, the kind of light that seemed to drain warmth from the world. Clouds gathered low, hanging heavy over the forested hills, their bellies swollen with the promise of more snow. The truck's tires crunched over the icy road as Caleb Ward steered away from town, heading west toward a place most people only spoke of in hushed tones, Cedarwood. The German shepherd in the passenger seat, Axel, sat tall and alert, his gaze fixed ahead, his body poised with the unshakable patience of a sentry. In the back seat, Mira Lane cradled Eli against her small frame, wrapping the baby in a blanket and pulling her own coat around him for extra warmth. Caleb glanced at them through the rearview mirror, catching the shadow of worry etched on Mira's face. Cedarwood had once been a state-run elder care facility closed nearly a decade ago after a fire that left parts of it charred and condemned. Officially, it was abandoned. Unofficially, it had become a ghost story, a place whispered about by those who claimed to see strange lights in its windows at night, a place where missing persons' names were never found again. Caleb didn't believe in ghost stories, but he believed in men who used forgotten buildings to hide things they didn't want seen. The heater hummed, filling the cabin with a thin veil of warmth, but the air was tense. The road narrowed as they left the last houses behind trees crowding in on either side, like dark sentinels. The snow here was deeper undisturbed, except for the faint twin ruts of tire tracks leading away from town, the same width, the same tread pattern as the ones Caleb had seen near the clinic. Halfway to Cedarwood, a soft sound broke the rhythm of the road. Eli whimpered. Then his breathing hitched, and when Caleb glanced back again, he saw the flush in the baby's cheeks, the sheen of sweat at his hairline despite the cold. Mira's voice trembled. "He feels really warm." Caleb slowed, pulling the truck onto a small clearing just off the road where a long-collapsed cabin lay in ruins. Only the stone hearth and a few skeletal beams remained now buried under snow. He killed the engine and climbed into the back. Axel hopping down to circle the perimeter, nose low, tail stiff with focus. Caleb's hand was steady as he touched the baby's forehead. But the warmth beneath his palm was alarming. He pulled his field medical kit from behind the seat, flipping it open with the efficiency of someone who had performed triage under far worse conditions. "Let's get him cooled down just a little," Caleb murmured. He wrapped Eli in a fresh, dry layer from his kit, gave him tiny sips of water from a dropper, then reached for the thermometer. The reading blinked back at him, 111.8. Not dangerous yet, but climbing. "Did your mom give him anything for this?" before Caleb asked, his voice calm but intent. Mira shook her head. "Not for a fever. But she had this red-capped medicine. She said it was for people who couldn't take the normal kind. She called it something like marrow. Meropenem." Caleb said, his eyes sharpening. "That's it," Mira replied quickly. Caleb exhaled slowly. Meropenem wasn't for children, not for anyone outside of a hospital setting. It was a potent antibiotic reserved for severe complicated infections. Whatever Clara had been keeping it for, it wasn't routine care. As if on cue, Axel gave a sharp bark from near the tree line. Caleb handed Eli back to Mira, zipped his coat, and stepped into the clearing. Snow clung to the edges of Axel's muzzle as the dog pawed at something half buried near the roots of a pine tree. Caleb knelt, brushing away the powdery snow to reveal a small glass vial, its label scuffed but still legible. Meropenem, IV, use only. Lot, num 312A. The seal was broken. Mira had followed to the edge of the clearing, holding Eli close. Her eyes widened. "That's the same medicine my mom kept in her red bag. It was always in the fridge. She said it wasn't for us, she was keeping it in case someone needed help." Caleb wrapped the vial in a clean cloth before tucking it into his pack, avoiding direct contact with the glass. "Then it's important," he said simply. The forest pressed close around them. branches whispering in the faint wind. Caleb could feel it now, that shift in the air. The prickling sense that somewhere nearby someone had stood here not long ago. Axel's body language confirmed it. The shepherd's head turned toward the narrow break in the trees at the far end of the clearing, his nose twitching, tail rigid. He moved forward, tracing the faintest outline of tire ruts leading west, the same as those on the road. "We're on the right track," Caleb said quietly as he returned to the truck. Mira climbed in, settling Eli against her shoulder, her small hand resting protectively over his back. The road to Cedarwood wound deeper into the hills, the pines crowding tighter, their limbs arching overhead like a rib cage. Snowflakes began to fall again, light and lazy at first, drifting sideways on a breeze that smelled faintly of ice and old wood. With every mile, the world seemed to grow quieter. The sounds of the engine and Axel's occasional shifting in his seat, the only reminders that they were not alone in an endless white wilderness. The deeper they went, the more the road felt like it was leading not just to a place, but into a different kind of silence. A silence that hid more than it revealed. Mira spoke again, her voice soft but sure. "Mom told me once, people hide bad things in places everyone forgets about. If I ever got lost, she said to find someone with a dog. That's how I'd know they were safe." Caleb glanced at her in the rearview mirror, meeting her eyes for just a moment. "She's right," he said. "And that's exactly what we're going to do, find her." Up ahead, the first glimpse of Cedarwood appeared through the trees, a sagging chain-link fence draped with vines and rust. A weathered sign hanging crooked, "Cedarwood State Care Facility," closed by order of the county. Beyond it, the building loomed 3 stories high, its windows dark or boarded over, the paint blistered and peeling like skin after a burn. A lone wheelchair sat half buried in the snow near the front ramp, abandoned and frozen in time. Caleb slowed the truck to a stop 100 yards from the gate, letting the engine idle as Axel rose in his seat. Ears pricked, eyes locked on the shadowed structure ahead. The air here was colder, heavier, as if the building itself exhaled a chill that the storm could not match. The chain on the gate hung loose where one section had already rusted through, swaying faintly in the breeze. Tire tracks, the same tread, curved in and out through the opening, fresh enough to cut through the crust of the last snowfall. Caleb killed the engine, the sudden absence of its hum making the quiet even sharper. Axel whined softly, his gaze never leaving the building. Mira sat still in the back, her arms tightening around Eli. They were here. The trail of tire tracks had led them to this place, an abandoned shell, but one that was not as empty as it pretended to be. Caleb stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He walked up to the gate, running a gloved hand along the frozen metal. The silence around Cedarwood felt alive, like a held breath waiting to be released. Axel came to his side, muscles taut, tail still. The shepherd's nose lifted to the air, drawing in a slow, deep breath before letting out a low, steady growl. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Whatever they were looking for. Clara, the truth, the men who had taken her, was somewhere beyond that fence, and they had just crossed into its shadow. The gate to Cedarwood sagged under the weight of years, its chain-link fabric mottled with rust and twined with brittle vines that rattled faintly in the wind. Caleb Ward stood before it, the cold biting into his cheeks, the air unnaturally still, for a place this vast. The world beyond the fence seemed carved from shadow and memory. A place abandoned in name, but still breathing in secret. With a quiet glance at Axel, Caleb reached for the bolt cutters slung over his shoulder. The steel jaws clamped over the chain, and with 2 firm squeezes the links gave way, the sound sharp and metallic against the muted winter air. The chain fell into the snow with a dull thud. He pushed the gate inward just enough to slip through, holding it steady so it wouldn't squeal against the hinges. Mira waited just inside the fence line, clutching Eli close, her eyes wide, as she followed Caleb and the German shepherd through the threshold. The snow here lay thinner, tamped down in places by recent foot traffic, betraying the truth that this was no forgotten ruin. The front entrance loomed ahead, a set of double doors, one hanging crooked on its hinges, the other shut but splintered along the frame. Caleb stepped over the threshold into a stale wave of air thick with mildew and damp plaster. It was the smell of time left unchecked, layered with something sharper metallic, almost medicinal. The hallway stretched before them, the ceiling sagging in places. Cracked tiles underfoot, slick with patches of frost, where the weather had forced its way inside. Faded wallpaper peeled like old skin from the walls, revealing stained plaster beneath. The buzzing hum of the outside world seemed to vanish the moment they crossed the line. Here, the only sounds were the soft tread of Caleb's boots, Mira's careful steps, and the faint click of Axel's claws on the warped floor. Wheelchairs stood abandoned at odd angles, their rubber grips coated in dust. A gurney sat half-shoved into a doorway, one wheel missing a forgotten relic of a place that had once promised care, but now whispered only neglect. Caleb's eyes moved, constantly scanning for movement, while Axel's nose stayed low-tail, a steady, controlled line of tension. They passed a nurse's station, its counter layered with brittle folders, whose paper edges curled and darkened with age. Yet here and there, amid the decay, Caleb spotted signs that the ruin was not complete. A stack of bandages still in sterile wrappers lay neatly in a plastic bin. A syringe package with an unbroken seal rested atop the counter. Dust around these items was disturbed, showing where gloved hands had been not long ago. This place? Mira's voice was a whisper, barely audible. It feels wrong. Caleb didn't answer. Her instincts mirrored his own. He raised a hand to slow their pace as Axel veered toward a side corridor. The shepherd's head lifted, suddenly ears swiveling, body angling toward a half-open door ahead. Caleb approached, slowly pushing it open with his shoulder. It was a small supply room, dimly lit through a gap in the boarded window. Most of the shelves sagged under the weight of rusted tools and cracked plastic containers. But near the center of the room lay something out of place. Axel had already reached it, a white lab coat rumpled and stained lying on the floor, as though it had been dropped in haste. Caleb crouched, lifting it carefully. The faint smell of antiseptic clung to the fabric. His eyes fell to the embroidery over the left breast pocket, Sassi Lane. Mira's breath caught. That's my mom's. She wore it all the time. She called it her armor. Caleb folded the coat with deliberate care and tucked it into his pack. It was proof not just of Clara's presence here, but of her resistance. On a nearby metal cart lay a stack of papers bound loosely with a rubber band. Caleb slid them free, scanning the cramped handwriting scrawled across the top page. Amid the dense tangle of medical shorthand, chemical symbols, and clipped phrases, 2 entries leapt from the page. Test subject number 7. Response remains unstable. Dosage pending review. Compound ZL7 requires recalibration before mass protocol. The words were underlined twice in red ink, the lines pressed so hard they indented the paper. Caleb's jaw tightened. The number 7 echoed in his mind. The same as the warning Mira had carried in her mother's note, trust no one without a dog. Whoever subject number 7 was, they were central to whatever was happening here. They moved on deeper into the heart of the building. The further they went, the stranger it became. The decay was less severe here. The air was cleaner, the dust disturbed in more places. A side door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" hung slightly ajar. Caleb eased it open to reveal a long, narrow corridor, unlike the others. Its walls were bare and freshly painted, the floor swept clean. The smell here was sharper disinfectant plastic and the faint electric tang of running equipment. At the end of the hall, a single steel door stood closed. Caleb tried the handle. It turned easily. He pushed it open and was greeted by a sight that didn't belong in a condemned building. The room beyond was spotless sterile white from floor to ceiling. Bright overhead lights glared down on 3 hospital beds, each fitted with straps and IV lines, the digital monitors beside them, silent but fully functional. Cabinets along one wall held neatly arranged supplies, unopened boxes of syringes, vials of clear liquid labeled only with codes, surgical instruments polished to a mirror sheen. On a tray near the center bed sat a half-used vial, its label printed in clean black text, ZL7. Caleb picked it up, turning it in his gloved hand. The liquid inside clung to the glass with an unnatural viscosity. He slipped it into a side pouch of his pack, his mind already cataloging what needed to be examined later. Then his eyes fell on the item beside the tray, a small black recording device no bigger than his palm. He pressed the single button on its surface, and after a brief hiss of static, a voice filled the sterile room. Male. Deep, precise. Every syllable measured. Subject 7 shows resistance to mid-tier sedation. Genetic markers remain favorable. If response to ZL7 stabilizes within the next 48 hours, proceed to final test. Dr. Voss has approved continuation despite initial objections from the nurse. Caleb's gaze darkened. The nurse, there was no doubt in his mind, was Clara. And she had fought against whatever they were doing here. The recording ended abruptly, the silence that followed sharper than the voice had been. Caleb set the device down, slowly the muscles in his jaw tightening. The walls seemed to press in closer, the air suddenly heavier. Mira had stayed near the doorway, clutching Eli, her eyes darting nervously around the too clean space. Axel padded forward to stand between her and the beds, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on a darkened corner of the room, as if expecting something to emerge. Caleb's instincts told him they'd learned enough for now. The trail was clear, ZL7. Clara's resistance and the shadow of Dr. Adrian Voss looming over all of it. But the clarity also meant danger was close. He stepped back toward the hallway, scanning the room one last time. The beds, the vial, the recording, they painted a picture of something far larger than an abandoned care facility. This was an active site hidden in plain sight, and they were standing in the middle of it. As they crossed back into the dim corridor, Caleb heard a faint sound from deeper inside the building. Not the creak of old wood or the whisper of settling dust, but a deliberate footstep. Axel's ears shot forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Caleb raised a hand for silence, his eyes narrowing toward the dark. The scent of antiseptic was still strong, but beneath it now came something else, something human. Somewhere ahead, behind one of these doors, someone else was here, watching, listening. The world outside Cedarwood was still locked in the pale hush of early morning when Caleb Ward returned. Frost rimmed the chain-link fence he'd cut the day before, each wire glittering faintly in the thin winter light. The storm clouds had broken during the night, leaving the sky washed in a brittle, icy blue that seemed to carry sound farther than it should. Every step he took toward the gate seemed louder, every crunch of snow beneath his boots sharper. Axel padded at his side, breath fogging in the cold air, his black and tan coat tipped with frost. The shepherd's head was low ears, pricked forward, moving with the silent certainty of a creature who knew exactly where he was going. Caleb trusted that more than anything. The dog had been here, once smelled the truth of the place, and now carried its memory like a map. Inside the fence, the building waited in stillness, its windows reflecting nothing, its shape heavy against the snow. Caleb slipped through the gap in the gate, closing it quietly behind him. The crunch of his boots was swallowed by the hollow quiet. The double doors gaped open just as they had before, their hinges frozen in rust. The moment they stepped inside, the air shifted. It was cooler than yesterday, yet tinged with the same antiseptic sharpness that marked an active presence. Caleb's breath came slower now, his senses tightening into focus. He kept one hand near the small pack slung across his chest, the other loose and ready. Axel moved ahead, nose working the air. His pace quickened as they crossed the main hall, passing the empty nurse's station and the sagging gurney. Caleb noticed the shepherd's tail straighten and stiffen the muscles along his shoulders, drawing taut. They were close. The dog veered sharply down a side corridor Caleb hadn't explored yesterday, a narrow passage lined with closed doors on either side. Most were shut, paint peeling in long strips, numbers hanging crooked above their frames. But Axel ignored them all, heading straight for the last door at the end. It was heavy industrial steel, painted dull gray, with a reinforced lock bolted into the frame. Caleb tried the handle. It didn't budge. Axel pressed his nose to the bottom edge, inhaling deeply, before stepping back with a low, vibrating growl. Someone was inside. Caleb dropped his pack, pulled a small pry bar from the side pocket, and wedged it against the latch. The lock gave with a hard metallic snap, the sound echoing too loud in the hallway. He eased the door open. The smell inside hit him first, stale air sweat, and the faint, acrid tang of fear. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Clara Lane sat slumped against the far wall, wrists bound in coarse rope, a strip of fabric tied loosely around her mouth. Her lab coat was gone, replaced by thin scrubs. Her hair tangled, her skin pale beneath the cold light filtering through a narrow barred window. Yet her eyes, when they lifted and locked on his, were fierce, burning with recognition and a warning all at once. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling to pull the gag free. "Clara," he said, voice low. She exhaled sharply, as though just having his name in the air gave her the strength to speak. "Caleb, you have to listen. There are more. They've taken others." "I don't know where they're keeping them, but—" Her words cut off with a sudden noise from behind a shuffle, a step. Caleb spun as a figure burst through the door they'd just come through. A man in a white lab coat, face half hidden behind a surgical mask, came at him fast, an uncapped syringe glinting in his hand. The fluid inside caught the light, a faint amber, unfamiliar, but dangerous. Axel moved first. The shepherd lunged, hitting the man square in the chest with the full force of his weight. The impact drove them both back into the doorframe, the syringe clattering to the floor. The man's cry was sharp, startled and muffled behind the mask. In the narrow space, the struggle was short. Axel's front paws pinned the man's shoulders, teeth bared just inches from his throat. Caleb seized the man's wrists, twisting them until the fight bled out of his limbs. He shoved him against the wall, pulling a length of cord from his pack and binding the man's hands tight behind his back. The syringe lay on the floor between them, its needle bent a single drop, trembling at the tip. Caleb kicked it far into the corner, away from all of them. Clara's voice was steadier now, though breathless. "He's one of Voss's. I've seen him in the lab. He handles the ZL-7 prep." Caleb gave the bound man a single hard look before turning back to Clara. He cut the ropes at her wrists, the coarse fibers falling away to reveal raw, reddened skin. She rubbed them absently, but her eyes kept darting to the door as if expecting more to follow. "We don't have long," she said. "If they know you're here, that's why we're leaving." Caleb interrupted, pulling her gently to her feet, but not empty-handed. He led the way into the corridor, Axel between them. They moved fast, retracing the path toward the cleaner, more modern section of cedarwood. The bound man was left in the locked room. Caleb had no illusions about him staying quiet, but every second counted. In the bright lab room they'd found yesterday, the sterile white surfaces seemed even starker against the memory of Clara's cell. Caleb went straight to the cabinets, scanning labels, pulling vials of ZL-7 into a padded case from his pack. Clara joined him, her hands moving with the practiced speed of someone who knew where to look. She pulled open a lower drawer, revealing stacks of thin folders labeled only with numbers, each one holding clipped photographs and test sheets. "These are the subject files," she murmured, her voice tight. "If we get these out, we can prove." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Axel's sudden low growl made Caleb turn sharply. The shepherd was standing at the doorway, ears, flat eyes locked on the hall beyond. "Move," Caleb said, slipping the folders into his pack. He crossed to the desk near the back wall, where a small tower computer sat beside a silent monitor. The casing was scratched, but clean dust-free. A portable hard drive lay beside it, still plugged in. He yanked the cable free, coiling it quickly. The hard drive was heavier than it looked. He shoved it into an inner pouch, the weight settling against his ribs. The vials, the files, the drive, everything they could carry, was now in his pack. Clara stood by the counter, one hand braced against it, her breathing uneven. She glanced toward the hallway again, and Caleb caught the flicker of fear in her expression. "Let's go," he said, moving past Axel into the hall. They retraced their path toward the main entrance, Caleb's pace steady but urgent. The long corridor seemed longer now, the peeling paint and sagging ceiling closing in as each step brought them closer to open air. Every shadow felt thicker, every doorway a potential threat. At the junction near the nurse's station, Clara stumbled slightly, catching herself on the wall. Caleb steadied her with a hand on her elbow. She was weaker than she'd let on her weight, leaning more heavily into him now. They rounded the last corner before the front doors and stopped. Two figures stood blocking the exit. Both wore white coats, their faces partially obscured by masks, but their stance was unmistakable. Broad, solid hands at their sides, like they were waiting. For a breath, no one moved. Snowlight spilled in from the open doorway behind them, outlining their shapes in a pale glow. Caleb shifted his stance, feeling Axel press slightly against his leg, the dog's body tense and ready. Clara's breath hitched quietly behind him. Then from somewhere deeper in the building, a door slammed. Footsteps echoed toward them, more than one set. Caleb's grip on the strap of his pack tightened. They were boxed in, at least for the moment, the open air just beyond those two white coats and the sound of pursuit coming from behind. Somewhere in this tightening noose, the path forward would have to open. The cold bit deeper as they stepped out of Cedarwood's shadow and into the open air. The winter morning had sharpened in their absent sunlight, breaking weakly through a veil of thin clouds, scattering pale gold across the snow-crusted ground. Caleb Ward kept one gloved hand wrapped around Clara's elbow to steady her, the other resting on the strap of the pack heavy with stolen vials files and the hard drive. Axel trotted close to his knee, black and tan coat rippling under the light breeze, every sense alive and searching. Behind them, the prisoner, a man in a white lab coat, wrists bound tight with cord, stumbled forward under the nudge of Caleb's shoulder. His face was pinched and sullen, the thin mask still hanging from one ear. The man muttered something low, but Caleb didn't slow or ask. Every second they stayed near the building was a second too long. The tree line stood about 40 yards from the cracked front steps, the snow there broken by narrow animal tracks and the faint depressions of something heavier passing through recently. Caleb led them toward a gap between two frost-bitten spruces. The old game trail beyond, winding toward the ridge where his truck was parked under camouflage netting. The snow muffled sound, but it couldn't erase the feeling, an almost physical sense that the forest was not empty. Axel's tail stiffened. His ears twitched left then right, his head lowering just slightly. Caleb read the signal instantly. "Keep moving," he murmured to Clara without turning his head. "And stay behind me." They reached the shadow of the first trees, the air thickening with the scent of pine sap and frozen earth. Caleb had just begun to believe they might slip away unseen, when the forest itself seemed to shift. From the gloom ahead, three figures emerged almost at once, rifles slung up to their shoulders in a practiced motion. Snow kicked up in sharp bursts around Caleb's boots as the first shot cracked the air. He spun to his right, pulling Clara with him, dropping low behind a fallen log, half buried in snow. The prisoner cried out as he felt his white coat standing out like a beacon. Axel launched forward in a blur, muscles coiling and releasing with pure precision. His paws struck the snow in a rapid rhythm, ears pinned back, teeth bared in a silent snarl. He hit the nearest gunman at the thigh, the impact sending the man crashing sideways into a tree trunk. The rifle skidded across the snow, useless now, as Axel's weight pinned him down. Caleb rose from his crouch, the cold bite of metal in his palm, as he brought his sidearm up. His breath came slow and steady, despite the surge of adrenaline. He found the second gunman through the bare lattice of winter branches, a clean sight picture, and squeezed. The report cracked through the trees. The man jerked, stumbled backward into the snow, his weapon tumbling from his grasp. The third attacker moved to flank them, his boots pounding across the frozen ground, but Clara was already pulling something from the deep pocket of her borrowed coat. Her hand closed around the small cylinder, one of the emergency smoke canisters Caleb had shoved into her hand back inside cedarwood. She yanked the pin with her teeth, flipped the lever, and hurled it down between them and their enemy. With a hiss and a sudden metallic tang, the canister erupted. Thick gray smoke billowed outward, swallowing the shapes of men and trees alike, curling in the air like a living thing. The world shrank to the circle of space around them, the silhouettes beyond blurring into formless shadows. Caleb caught Axel's shape bounding back through the fog, his jaws still set tight on the captured man's sleeve. The shepherd released him, only at Caleb's sharp command, falling back to his side with a rumble still in his chest. Through the shifting curtain of smoke came another figure, taller, broader in the shoulders, moving with deliberate calm that made him more dangerous than the frantic gunman. The face that emerged from the haze was framed by steel-colored hair, his expression measured and cold as the snow beneath their feet. His eyes, a flat pale gray, held none of the heat of the fight around them. "Caleb Ward," the man said, voice carrying even in the muffled air. "I had a feeling you'd come." Clara's breath caught beside him. "Price," she whispered, almost too quiet to hear. "Dr. Lawrence Price." The name landed heavy a shape from whispered warnings and half-hidden files. He wore no lab coat here, only a dark winter jacket and gloves, yet something about him spoke more loudly than the weapons in the hands of his men. This was the one who gave orders, the one the others looked to before moving. Price's gaze flicked to Clara, lingering for a heartbeat before returning to Caleb. "You have something that belongs to me," he said. It wasn't a threat, not in tone, but a statement as certain as the snow underfoot. Caleb's grip tightened slightly on his weapon, the pack's weight a steady reminder at his shoulder. Axel stood between them, silent, the muscles along his back taut. "I think you know you're not walking away with her," Price went on, nodding faintly toward Clara. "Or with what you've taken." The smoke thinned just enough for Caleb to see movement beyond Price, shapes closing in their outlines, shifting through the haze. Caleb took a slow breath, feeling the frost sting his lungs, and let it out in an even tone. "Funny thing about that," he said. "You're not the only one who knew I'd come." Price's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. "I made a call before we ever set foot in your little playground." Caleb continued, his voice still calm, though the moment crackled with tension. "SWAT's been on their way since before sunrise, and by now, they're close enough to hear every word we're saying." For the first time, something in Price's face shifted, not much, but enough for Caleb to see the calculation there, the subtle weighing of advantage against risk. The man's pale eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest crease forming at the corner. Somewhere deeper in the forest, faint but distinct, came the sound of engines, slow at first, muffled by distance, then building as tires bit into frozen ground. The steady chop of rotor blades followed, slicing the cold air from above. Price's gaze lingered on Caleb for another heartbeat, then slid to Axel, then to Clara. He gave a small, almost courteous nod, as if acknowledging the shift in balance, before stepping back into the shelter of the smoke. His outline blurred, then vanished entirely. The engines grew louder. Somewhere in the fog, a voice barked orders, sharp and authoritative. Snow crunched under heavy boots approaching fast from the ridge side. Caleb kept his weapon up, scanning the tree line, even as the smoke began to drift apart. Clara stood close now, her breath still quick, her eyes following the fading shape of Price as if trying to memorize it. Axel's ears tracked the incoming sound, but his body stayed loose beside Caleb's leg. Beyond the haze, dark shapes in tactical gear began to emerge, weapons angled low, but ready their visors catching brief flashes of pale winter sun. And just as the first of them stepped into full view, the prisoner behind them gave a short, strange laugh that made Caleb's shoulders tighten again. The forest erupted with movement and sound as the first dark-clad figures of the SWAT team broke through the thinning curtain of smoke, their boots biting deep into the frozen earth, the pale sunlight glinting off the black curves of their helmets and the glassy surfaces of their visors. Commands rang out in clipped bursts, each word snapping like the crack of ice underfoot. Caleb lowered his weapon, his shoulders shifting from combat readiness to the taut patience of someone who knew the momentum of the moment was no longer in his hands. Axel stood beside him, sides heaving from exertion, but eyes bright, his breath rising in quick clouds that shimmered in the cold air. His gaze flicked from one armored figure to the next, ears pricked forward, body still poised to spring if the tide of the fight shifted again. The restrained prisoner behind them had stopped his strange laughter, though the residue of it seemed to linger in the tense air, like the last faint echo of a gunshot. Two SWAT operators swept past, taking custody of the man, without a word, their movements precise and practiced, as they pulled him into the containment of plastic cuffs and guided him back toward the line forming deeper in the trees. From the far side of the clearing, Price emerged at last, no longer shielded by smoke or the uncertainty of distance. His pale eyes took in the scene, the black wall of armed responders, the sharp angles of rifles at the ready. And for the first time, Caleb saw the weight of calculation give way to the inevitability of loss. A voice firm and unyielding ordered him to drop any weapons and step forward. Price complied with measured slowness, as if still trying to shape the tempo of a moment that no longer belonged to him. In the harsh clarity of daylight, he looked less like a figure out of shadowed corridors and whispered threats, and more like an aging man in a heavy coat, the frost clinging to the dark weave at his collar. Yet there was no mistaking the gravity in the way the SWAT commander himself took hold of his arm and turned him toward the waiting line of vehicles. The forest seemed to exhale as the tension bled from it, the stillness of snow and pine reclaiming the air once filled with danger. Clara stood very still, her eyes locked on Price as he passed, flanked by armed officers. Her lips parted slightly, a breath escaping as if a thread she'd been holding taut for days had finally snapped. "That's him," she said to the nearest agent. Her voice was soft but steady. He ran human trials, without consent. He drugged them, experimented on them, discarded them when he was done. The agent nodded once, already jotting the words into a small waterproof notebook. Caleb glanced at her, seeing the lines of exhaustion etched deep into her face, but also the fierce light that came when someone stepped from the shadow of fear into the clarity of truth. He rested a gloved hand briefly on her shoulder, not to steady her, but as an unspoken acknowledgement of the ground they had just crossed together. Near the tree line, Mira appeared with Eli still bundled in her arms, her small figure half hidden behind the armored bulk of one of the SWAT medics who had ferried them from the perimeter. The girl's cheeks were flushed with cold, her hair a tangle of wind-blown strands against her forehead. But her eyes, wide, deep, and steady, found Caleb instantly. The medic crouched to check Eli's temperature one more time, murmuring reassurances, but Mira stepped forward a pace, the snow crunching softly under her boots. "You saved us," she said, her voice high and clear against the backdrop of clipped radio chatter and the distant hum of engines. "Just like Mom said you would." The words landed with the quiet force of something both fragile and unbreakable, cutting through the cold and the aftermath in a way no victory shout could. Caleb felt them settle somewhere deep, the kind of truth that would still be there long after the headlines faded. He met her gaze and gave a single solemn nod, as if to tell her that some promises, spoken or unspoken, were worth every mile, every risk. Axel moved to stand between them, his tail sweeping once, then again across the snow. Not in the exuberant arcs of a carefree dog, but in the measured rhythm of an animal who understood the tone of the moment. One of the SWAT team's K9 handlers approached his face, breaking into a smile as he reached to ruffle the fur behind Axel's ears. "Hell of a dog you've got," he said to Caleb. "Textbook courage out there." Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes followed Axel's proud stance, the way the shepherd's chest rose and fell, the dark intelligence in his gaze. "Yeah," he said at last, his voice low enough that only the handler could hear. "He's more than that." From somewhere deeper in the trees, a voice called for transport to be prepped, and the small knot of remaining SWAT members began to shift, guiding their captives down toward the waiting vehicles. The hard-packed trail crunched under the weight of boots and tires, the air filling with the mingled scents of fuel exhaust and cold pine. Clara turned toward Caleb, her expression already leaning toward the next question, the next step. "You know it's not over, right?" she said quietly. "There are files, missing people we still don't know about, and whatever ZL7 really is." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. He had known even before Price's hands were bound that this was only a visible fragment of something larger, the kind of operation that left roots deep and tangled beneath the surface. "We'll find the rest," he said, and there was no need to add more. Above them, the weak sun slipped behind a shifting curtain of cloud, the light going softer, turning the snow to muted silver. Mira leaned into Clara's side now, still holding Eli close, her small hand fisted in the fabric of her mother's coat. The SWAT commander stepped over his visor, pushed up his weathered face, carrying the lines of someone long familiar with the thin edge between success and loss. "We'll take it from here," he told Caleb, though his gaze lingered on Axel as if measuring the dog's weight in the day's outcome. "But you should stick close. There'll be questions, and answers you might want to hear." Caleb nodded once, then crouched to check the straps on the pack that held their evidence. The cold crept through his gloves, but he ignored it. Axel brushed against his side, leaning in with the solid reassurance of a partner who didn't measure days in victories or defeats, only in whether they stood together at the end of them. The convoy began to move, engines rumbling low as the first vehicles rolled toward Frost Hollow proper. In the distance, the narrow road would open into the snowbound streets of the town, where the winter sun glanced off rooftops, and every plume of chimney smoke marked a place still untouched by what they had faced. As they followed the line down, Caleb let his gaze sweep the ridges, the frozen river cutting through the valley, the quiet houses that seemed to huddle against the cold. The storm had broken here for now, but the air still carried a sharpness that spoke of unfinished things. Mira's voice came again, softer this time, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to anyone else. "Mom always said there are people who keep watch, even when you can't see them." She looked up at Caleb, and there was no fear left in her face, only the unshaken certainty of someone who had glimpsed that truth for herself. The words hung there, simple and unadorned, as the last of the captives were loaded into the waiting vans. Snow began to fall again, light and soundless, dusting the road ahead and blurring the edges of the trail they had cut through the forest. And somewhere beyond that slow curtain of white, Caleb knew there were still doors left to open and shadows waiting to be named. The snow in Evergreen Hills was softer than in Frost Hollow, falling in slower, gentler spirals that seemed to linger in the air before touching the ground, as though reluctant to disturb the tidy rows of houses nestled in their white blankets. Here the mountains stood at a more forgiving distance, their peaks rounded by time, their slopes clothed in evergreens that gave the town its name. Clara Lane stood at the kitchen window of a small rented house, a mug of steaming chamomile tea warming her hands, and watched as her daughter and son played on the cleared path outside Mira's scarf, trailing behind her. As she dashed through the shallow snowdrifts, Eli bundled like a tiny snowman in a thick wool suit. It had been 3 weeks since the government agents had driven them away from Frost Hollow under the quiet banner of the Witness Protection Program, each mile adding a layer of separation from the memory of Cedarwood's shadowed hallways and the men who had moved like ghosts through its corridors. Their new address was known only to a handful of officials. The town itself welcomed them with polite distance. Neighbors waved from porches but didn't linger, perhaps sensing without being told that this was a family for whom a certain space was not only kind but necessary. In those first mornings, Clara would wake with a jolt, half expecting to hear the muffled cries from a locked room or the low hum of laboratory machinery. Instead, she heard the ordinary symphony of a small town beginning its day. The faint rumble of a delivery truck, the crack of ice being chipped from a driveway, the sudden laughter of children late for school. Each sound was a stitch sewing her into a life that felt both fragile and precious. Back in Frost Hollow, Caleb Ward walked the main street with Axel at his side. The German shepherd's paws leaving clean prints in the fresh snow. The town council had called a small gathering in the community hall the week after the raid. There in front of a modest crowd, the mayor had pinned a circular medal onto a deep blue ribbon and slipped it over Axel's head. The inscription read, "Valor Companion," in clean engraved letters, catching the light as Axel tilted his head, unaware of the formality, but fully aware of the pride in Caleb's voice as he murmured, "Good boy." The applause had been warm but brief, the kind that carries respect without turning a hero into a spectacle. Life for Caleb had settled into the slow rhythm of winter in Frost Hollow. He made his rounds, as he always had, checking the ridgelines for signs of snow shift, lending a hand at the old firehouse when the younger volunteers needed a steady voice, and letting Axel roam the fields by the river in the early mornings. Yet there were evenings when he would pause on the porch, looking out toward the dark line where forest met horizon, and feel the faint tug of something unfinished, a thread left hanging in the weave of the story they had lived. In Evergreen Hills, Mira was building a new kind of story. At first she clung to her mother's side, holding Eli tightly, her eyes tracking every passing stranger. But over time, the small rituals of safety took root. The locked doors, the steady presence of local officers who passed by without fanfare, the school counselor who knew how to listen without pressing. Mira began to spend afternoons at the community center's art room, where the scent of colored pencils and paper glue filled the air. One afternoon, Clara found her sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a sheet of heavy paper spread before her. On it, drawn in bold, looping lines, was the unmistakable figure of a German shepherd chest. Proud eyes bright, a small girl perched on his back, as if he were both steed and guardian. Above them, in bubble letters, Mira had written Axel, the four-legged hero. Clara knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Is that from the day he found us?" she asked. Mira nodded her pencil, already moving to sketch the outline of a forest in the background. "It's going to be a comic book," she said. "Every page will be about Axel, how he saved us, how he's the bravest dog in the world." The pages multiplied quickly, Axel leaping over fallen trees, Axel sniffing out danger in dark hallways, Axel standing between the children and shadowy shapes. The drawings were sometimes rough, sometimes startlingly detailed, as if Mira had captured the very angle of his gaze in those moments when safety was still a fragile thing. Clara kept the finished pages in a neat folder, but she also pinned some to the refrigerator where Eli's tiny hands would pat them, as if he too remembered. She noticed how the act of creation seemed to lift something from Mira's shoulders, giving her a way to carry the memory without being carried by it. Letters arrived for Clara now and then, forwarded through official channels. Some were from distant relatives who had pieced together fragments of the news, others from strangers who had read about the raid in a small-town paper and felt compelled to write. She answered each one in her careful handwriting, never giving away more than she could, but always ending with a line about hope, the kind that grows in the smallest spaces when someone chooses to guard it. In Frost Hollow, Caleb kept in touch through the quietest means possible. A postcard would arrive at Clara's house every couple of weeks, always unsigned, always bearing a photograph of a mountain or a lake, and always with a single sentence in block letters. All's well here. She would place each card in a wooden box on the mantel, a silent collection of proof that the thread between their lives had not been cut. Axel's medal hung by the door of Caleb's cabin, not as a display, but as a reminder. Some mornings before heading out, Caleb would pause to let his fingers rest on the cool metal, hearing again the echo of Mira's voice. Just like Mom said you would. He understood that heroism was not the medal nor the applause, but the choice to stand in the space between danger and the innocent, again and again, even when no one was watching. One weekend, Clara took Mira and Eli to the Evergreen Hills library, a bright building with tall windows that let in the winter light. Mira carried her folder of drawings under one arm, and by the time they left, the librarian had promised to help her scan them into a little booklet they could print. That night, Mira sat at her desk, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration, adding the final touches to a panel where Axel stood in a beam of sunlight, the word "safe" written above in bold letters. Clara watched her from the doorway, feeling the quiet satisfaction of seeing her daughter shape the story into something she could own. Outside, the snow fell without wind, a steady curtain softening the edges of the world. Eli stirred in his crib, murmured once, and drifted back into the deep, untroubled sleep of the very young. And yet, even in this peace, there were moments, a sound in the night, a van slowing at the corner that reminded Clara how fragile such peace could be. It was in those moments that she would picture Frost Hollow, the shadowed woods, the unwavering gaze of a shepherd with frost on his fur, and she would know that distance did not erase connection. One afternoon, as she sorted laundry in the warm hum of the dryer, Mira came running in from the porch, cheeks flushed. "Mom, there's a man outside. He left something on the steps." Clara's heart jolted, but when she opened the door, the only thing there was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. No address, no note. Inside was a plush German shepherd toy, its fur black and tan, a tiny blue ribbon around its neck with the words "Stay Brave" stitched in silver thread. Clara held it for a long moment before passing it to Mira, who hugged it without question. Through the window she scanned the quiet street, but whoever had left it was gone, folded into the ordinary rhythms of the town. That night, Mira placed the toy beside her pillow, and when Clara checked on her later, she found her daughter's hand resting on it the same way she had once rested her hand on Axel's back. In Frost Hollow, Caleb sat at his desk, a mug of cooling coffee at his elbow. Axel stretched at his feet. On the table lay a folder thick with documents, some from the official investigation, others copied quietly from places where such papers were not meant to linger. His eyes moved over the lines of text, pausing at names and dates that still didn't fit together cleanly. Axel stirred, lifting his head as if sensing the shift in his handler's focus. Caleb leaned back, letting the chair creak softly. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, and the sky pressed low over the mountains. He reached down to scratch behind Axel's ears, his voice a low murmur in the quiet cabin. "We're not done yet, buddy." Far away in Evergreen Hills, the snow kept falling. The night kept deepening, and in a little bedroom lit by the faint glow of a nightlight, Mira dreamed of a dog with eyes like dark fire racing through the trees toward her, the word "safe" still bright in the air. And in that dream's shadow, a door creaked open, somewhere else entirely spilling light onto a floor that had not seen daylight in years. The first signs of spring in Evergreen Hills were not bold proclamations, but quiet gestures. Thin streams of meltwater slipping down the sides of the road, the damp scent of thawed earth, and the way the air carried a softness that promised warmth even as it still held the crispness of winter. On the outskirts of town, where the fields sloped gently toward the mountains, a dark green pickup truck appeared on the winding road, its tires humming against the damp asphalt. Inside, Caleb Ward sat at the wheel, one hand resting lightly on the steering column, the other occasionally reaching down to give Axel a slow scratch behind the ears. The German Shepherd sat upright on the passenger seat, head angled toward the half-open window, nose twitching at the unfamiliar blend of scents, fresh soil chimney smoke fading for the season, and the faint trace of a bakery somewhere ahead. Caleb had told no one in Evergreen Hills that he was coming. The trip was not an obligation, nor an official matter. It was simply something he knew he had to do. The miles between Frost Hollow and this town had been filled with long stretches of silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of the road and the occasional thump of Axel's tail when Caleb glanced over at him. In the glove compartment, wrapped in plain paper, was a small frame containing a photograph taken by one of the SWAT officers in the aftermath of Cedarwood, a picture of Axel standing in the snow, his fur-dusted white mirror clinging to his neck. Caleb had carried it here as quietly as one carries something meant to be placed, not given. By the time they turned onto the street where Clara Lane now lived, the afternoon light had begun to mellow into that golden softness unique to early spring, when the sun hovers low and every shadow is edged in warmth. The house was small, painted a pale yellow with green shutters, the front yard edged by a low white fence. In the driveway, a tricycle lay tipped on its side, and from somewhere inside came the faint sound of laughter, high clear unguarded. Clara answered the door before Caleb could knock twice. She stood in the frame with a look that was part surprise, part recognition, as though she had known this moment might come, but had never dared to name it. Her hair was looser than he remembered, curling a little at the ends, and her eyes softened as they fell on Axel. "You came," she said, and it wasn't a question. Mira appeared behind her mother, stopping short when she saw them, her eyes widening in that same mixture of excitement and disbelief that had crossed her face in the woods months ago. Eli, toddling with the uneven determination of a child just past his second birthday, clutched a stuffed German Shepherd in one hand and made a small, delighted sound that was more breath than word. "Hi, Caleb," said his voice quiet but carrying a warmth that didn't need volume. "Thought we'd check in." The reunion happened in the way true reunions often do not, with fanfare, but with the seamless folding together of presences as though the time apart had been only a pause in an ongoing conversation. Clara stepped back to let them in, and Axel, after a brief pause on the threshold, trotted inside, sniffing the air as if mapping this new terrain into his memory. The living room was bright with light spilling through lace curtains, catching on the edges of framed photographs, some from before Evergreen Hills, some clearly taken here. In one corner, a stack of Mira's comic pages lay neatly on a low table. She darted over to it, flipping through until she found a fresh sheet, then turned and held it out to Caleb. "This is for you," she said, her voice shy but steady. The drawing was in color this time, colored pencil strokes layered to give depth to the scene. It showed the four of them, Clara, Mira, Eli, and Caleb, standing together beneath a wide, leafy tree, with Axel at the center, his chest puffed out, his eyes drawn with a precision that captured something alive. Above them, in curved letters, it read, "Family." Caleb took the paper carefully, as though it were something that could be bruised. For a long moment he said nothing, only looked at it, his thumb tracing lightly over the penciled lines. "You've gotten even better," he said at last, and though the words were simple, they held an entire weight of meaning. Pride, gratitude, and the quiet astonishment of being included in a picture that was meant to last. Clara disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with mugs of coffee for the adults, warm milk for the children, and a small dish of something for Axel, who accepted it with the dignity of a guest who knows he is welcome. The air inside carried the faint scent of cinnamon, and outside the pale light had deepened toward evening. They spent the next hours in easy conversation, stories about the new school, about Eli's habit of hiding small toys in the kitchen drawers, about the neighbors who brought over bread just because. Caleb shared news from Frost Hollow, the thaw on the river, the reopening of the old general store, the way the mountains looked when the mist lifted just after dawn. It was the kind of talk that didn't need to fill every silence, the kind where pauses were simply spaces to breathe. As the day leaned toward dusk, Clara glanced at the clock, then at Caleb. "You'll stay the night, won't you?" She asked the question, sounding less like an invitation and more like a natural extension of the moment. Caleb hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," she said, and there was no mistaking the steadiness in her voice. After dinner, a simple meal of roasted chicken potatoes and the first asparagus of the season, they lingered at the table, the children growing drowsy as the light faded to a soft blue. Mira leaned her head against her mother's arm, her eyelids heavy, while Eli sat in Caleb's lap, fascinated by the way Axel's ears shifted at every sound outside. Later, when the children had been tucked into bed and the house had settled into the deep quiet that comes only when the day has given all it has to give, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked softly beneath his boots. The air was cool but gentle, carrying the distant scent of damp grass and the first blossoms from somewhere down the street. Axel lay stretched out at the top of the steps. His front paws crossed his head, lifted as he watched the slow descent of the sun. The horizon glowed in layered shades of gold and rose, and in that light the dog's silhouette looked both timeless and completely of the moment. Caleb lowered himself onto the porch rail, resting one hand on Axel's back. Inside, Clara moved quietly through the rooms, checking locks, adjusting curtains, the small rituals of someone who knew the value of safety. Through the open doorway, the warm light from the living room spilled onto the porch, mixing with the fading glow of the day. Caleb thought of the miles he had driven, the places he had been, and the lives that had intersected with his own in ways neither planned nor expected. Some people were part of your beginning, he realized, and others, rarer perhaps, were the ones who stayed, not because they had to, but because they chose to, through storms and distance and the long, ordinary days in between. Clara stepped out onto the porch, then a light sweater around her shoulders. She stood beside him, her gaze following his toward the horizon. For a while they didn't speak. They didn't need to. When she did, her voice was soft but certain. "Family isn't just where you start," she said. "It's who's still here at the end." Caleb looked at her, then down at Axel, whose eyes were fixed on the darkening yard ears, attuned to every shift in the wind. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The last of the sun slipped behind the hills, leaving a band of deep orange that would soon fade tonight. Somewhere in the trees a bird called once, twice, then fell silent. The air cooled another degree, but on the porch there was warmth enough in the quiet, in the company, in the knowledge that this too was a kind of home. Axel stayed where he was, a still watchful figure against the gathering dark, the soft rise and fall of his breathing, steady as the heartbeat of the house itself. In the fading light, with the voices of the day, now only echoes, he kept his post beside the people who mattered, his gaze steady, as if promising in his own wordless way that he would remain there as long as they needed him until the very end.